History has a cruel sense of humor. Sometimes the monster doesn't hide in shadows. Sometimes the world crowns him a hero. He killed millions. He starved entire nations. He built his empire on silence, fear, and graves. And yet, when the world began to burn, they called him savior. They called him friend. They called him Uncle Joe. Stalin, the strong man of Russia. Stalin, the key to victory. Stalin, our ally in the East. For the West, survival demanded blindness. Britain needed a wall against Hitler. America needed a partner with tanks, not morals. And so, the line between dictator and defender blurred. The man who once purged his own army would now command the armies of liberation. The man who silenced his people would now speak for freedom. They knew what he was. They knew what he had done. But in the fog of war, truth became negotiable, and the world, desperate for hope, accepted tyranny as its ally. Because sometimes, in the name of victory, we trade morality for survival. And when we did, the devil smiled from the Kremlin, and the world named him Uncle Joe. Before the world called him Uncle Joe, they called him something else. A tyrant, a butcher, a man whose hands were already red long before the war began. It was 1939. Europe trembled on the edge of chaos. Hitler was hungry for war, and Stalin was hungry for power. In August of that year, the unthinkable happened. Two enemies, the Nazi and the Bolshevik, sat at the same table. They smiled. They shook hands. They signed a deal that would set the world on fire. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. But hidden inside its secret clauses, a map of Europe carved like a corpse. Poland divided. The Baltic states promised to Moscow. Finland marked for invasion. That night, the two most ruthless men in history became partners in conquest. Hitler struck west, Stalin struck east, and Poland, trapped between monsters, was devoured in weeks. The West condemned Hitler's invasion, but few spoke of the Soviet one, because by then, truth was already buried under politics. Then came Katyn. Thousands of Polish officers, scholars, priests marched into Soviet forests and never returned. When their graves were discovered years later, Moscow blamed the Germans, but the bullets said otherwise, each one fired by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. And yet, despite the blood, Stalin's machine kept rolling. He invaded Finland in the winter of 1939. A small nation fought back with knives and courage. The world watched the Red Army stumble. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers frozen, starved, humiliated. But Stalin learned. He purged the generals who failed. He rebuilt his war machine. And he waited for the next storm to come. By 1940, Europe was collapsing. France fell. Britain stood alone. And in Moscow, Stalin smiled quietly. He had played both sides, and for the moment, he was winning. He sent Hitler raw materials: oil, grain, metals, everything Germany needed to crush the West. Trains rolled day and night from Soviet stations, straight into the heart of the Nazi war machine. The world saw this. They knew. But no one dared move. No one wanted another enemy. But Hitler had no intention of sharing Europe. And Stalin, in his paranoia, knew it. He could smell betrayal. But he didn't know when it would come. He kept signing reports. He ignored warnings. He silenced officers who dared to speak of a German invasion. Because dictators don't believe truth. They only believe control. And then, one morning, the control vanished. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers poured into Soviet lands. The pact was broken. The monster Stalin fed had come for him. In a single day, the Soviet illusion of security turned into dust. And that's where the story changes. Because from that moment, the world would begin rewriting Stalin's image. The dictator, the killer of his own people, was about to become the savior of Europe. June 22nd, 1941. The silence of Moscow shattered. The sky above the Soviet frontier burned red. Hitler's invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had begun. 3 million German troops, thousands of tanks, and a river of fire rolled toward the east. In hours, Soviet defenses collapsed. Entire divisions disappeared. Cities fell before Stalin's orders even reached them. Inside the Kremlin, panic spread like smoke. For 2 days, Stalin said nothing, not a word. His officers waited. His people waited. Even the radio went silent. Then, on July 3rd, 1941, the dictator spoke. Not to the party, but to the nation. He called it the Great Patriotic War. He invoked the spirit of the Russian motherland, the legacy of 1812, the defense against Napoleon, the same man who once destroyed millions of his own people, now called them his children. And they listened. They had no choice, and nowhere else to turn. Factories shifted to war production overnight. Women forged shells. Children carried bricks to rebuild rail lines. The machine of terror became a machine of war. The battle for Moscow began in October 1941. The German army was only miles away from the city. Government officials begged Stalin to evacuate. He refused. Winter came early that year. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. German tanks froze. Engines died. And Soviet soldiers, some barefoot, fought until their hands bled on their rifles. By January 1942, the impossible happened. Moscow stood, the first real German defeat of the war. And in that moment, the world began to see Stalin differently. To Churchill, the Soviet Union was no longer an enemy. It was a shield between London and Hitler's armies. To Roosevelt, it was a chance. A second front that could bleed the Nazis dry. And so, the man once condemned as a tyrant became an essential partner. The newspapers changed their tone. Cartoons in New York papers called him Uncle Joe. American war correspondents described him as quiet, wise, unbreakable. They forgot the gulags. They forgot the purges. They forgot the millions who vanished before the war ever began. Because now, he was useful. And in war, usefulness becomes virtue. From the Arctic Circle to the Persian Gulf, ships carried food, tanks, and trucks to Soviet ports. It was called Lend-Lease. To Stalin, it was leverage. To the West, it was survival. But inside the Red Army, desperation turned brutal. By the summer of 1942, retreats were constant. Cities fell one after another. Stalin saw weakness, and weakness to him was treason. On July 28, 1942, he signed a new decree, Order Number 227. 3 words echoed through every command post. Not one step back. Any soldier who retreated without orders would be shot. Behind each front line, NKVD units waited with machine guns, ready to fire on their own men. They called them blocking detachments. Their purpose was simple: make fear stronger than death. Tens of thousands were executed. More were sent to penal battalions. Suicide units thrown into impossible battles. To the outside world, this was portrayed as discipline. To those who lived it, it was slaughter in uniform. But behind the smiles, nothing changed inside the Kremlin. The NKVD still hunted traitors. Officers who failed were shot. Villages suspected of cowardice were burned. Deserters executed in public squares. He didn't reform, he adapted. And through that adaptation, he became indispensable. The Red Army bled more than any other nation on earth, and the world repaid that blood with silence. By the end of 1942, Stalin's portrait hung in Allied war rooms. His name appeared beside Churchill and Roosevelt. The man who once ruled through fear was now being sold to the public as a symbol of hope. That was the power of the moment and the hypocrisy of the age. Because the world didn't forgive him. They simply needed him. While Soviet soldiers froze and bled at Stalingrad, another battle was being fought far from the front. A battle of images. A war of words. In London and Washington, the world's perception of Joseph Stalin was being rewritten. Marshal Stalin, the firm, calm leader of the Russian people. That was how Western audiences heard his name, not as a dictator, not as a mass murderer, but as a partner, as the man who stood against Hitler. To win this war, the Allies needed unity, and unity demanded illusion. Hollywood got to work. American films showed brave Russian farmers, laughing Soviet workers, heroic Red Army soldiers marching for freedom. In one propaganda short, Stalin's photo appeared beside Roosevelt's and Churchill's. 3 smiling allies, guardians of civilization. No mention of the gulags. No mention of the purges. No mention of the millions starved in Ukraine. The past was simply erased because it made victory uncomfortable. To the public, he became Uncle Joe. The nickname began with Western journalists, an attempt to make him sound approachable, human, safe. It spread quickly through newspapers, radio, even cartoons. The name stripped away the terror, the fear, and the smell of death that followed him since the 1930s. In Britain, Churchill called Stalin the great ally. In America, Roosevelt praised the valiant Russian people and their great leader. The image of Stalin standing firm at Stalingrad became the symbol of resistance. And when the Red Army finally pushed the Germans back in early 1943, the myth was sealed. The world saw the victory. They didn't see the price. Behind the lines, NKVD units still executed thousands. Whole ethnic groups, the Volga Germans, the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, were accused of collaboration and deported by force. Entire populations loaded into trains, shipped to Siberia in the middle of winter. Tens of thousands died on the journey. But no one in the West wanted to ask questions. The myth was too useful, too necessary. Stalin's brutality had become the foundation of Allied morale. His terror machine, the reason the front still held. So they looked away, because looking too closely meant confronting the truth, that one tyranny was being used to destroy another. For the first time in history, the world didn't just ignore a dictator, it celebrated him. And as Stalin's armies marched westward, as the tide of war began to turn, his shadow grew longer, reaching from Moscow all the way into the hearts of London and Washington. The man who ruled by fear was now cheered by free nations. The man who silenced millions was now given a voice on the world stage. And the name the world whispered with dread had become a term of endearment. Uncle Joe. February 1943. The ruins of Stalingrad stood silent. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were dead. Entire divisions wiped out. But the red banner flew above the shattered city, a symbol that Hitler could bleed and Stalin could win. The victory transformed Stalin. No longer a desperate leader hiding behind propaganda. He was now the man who defeated Hitler's army. In the eyes of the world, Stalin was a hero. In his own eyes, he was untouchable. But victory didn't soften him. It hardened him. Because for Stalin, every triumph was another reason to tighten control. He began his own war, not against Hitler, but against his own people. Inside the Soviet Union, even whispers could kill. If you celebrated too much, you were spreading panic. If you mourned the dead too openly, you were disloyal. The NKVD watched everything, every factory, every frontline camp, every conversation. And as Soviet forces advanced westward, Stalin's paranoia marched with them. In the liberated territories, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, the NKVD followed behind the Red Army. Their job wasn't just to chase Nazis, it was to erase anyone who might oppose Moscow's rule. In villages once occupied by Germany, peasants who had simply survived under Nazi rule were branded as traitors. In Poland, the same officers who fought for freedom were labeled fascist collaborators. Thousands were deported, imprisoned, or executed. It was the same old Stalin. Only now, the world was too busy celebrating him to notice. November 1943, Tehran Conference. The first meeting of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The cameras flashed. The world saw three men united against tyranny. But behind the smiles, Stalin was already shaping the post-war world. He spoke softly, politely, but every sentence carried steel. He demanded the Second Front in Europe. He demanded control of Eastern Europe, and neither Roosevelt nor Churchill dared to press too hard. Because the Red Army, the same army that bled at Stalingrad, was now unstoppable. By 1944, Soviet troops had pushed deep into Eastern Europe. Every mile gained on the battlefield was another piece of territory under Stalin's shadow. As the Allies landed in Normandy, he prepared his own occupation in the East. Behind every liberation came a purge. Behind every victory parade, a mass grave. Then came 1945. Berlin was burning. Hitler was dead. And for the first time, the Soviet flag flew above the Reichstag. The West called it victory. Stalin called it justice. But to millions across Eastern Europe, it was just a new kind of occupation. The NKVD set up offices in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest. Local leaders who dreamed of democracy disappeared overnight. The Soviet Union, once seen as a savior, became a new empire built on fear. When Churchill and Roosevelt met Stalin again at Yalta, they called him Uncle Joe to his face. They toasted with wine. They smiled for the cameras. None of them asked about the prisoners. None of them asked about the deportations, the executions, or the people whose only crime was wanting freedom. Because by then, Stalin had won twice. He defeated Hitler, and he convinced the world to forget who he really was. He emerged from the war as the most powerful man on earth. His borders expanded, his influence unchallenged. While Europe lay in ruins, Stalin sat at the top of it all. The world saw him as a savior. But for those who lived under his rule, the war never ended. It simply changed its name. May 9th, 1945. Berlin had fallen. The guns were silent. The war was over. The Soviet Union called it Victory Day. For the world, it was the end of hell. For Stalin, it was the beginning of his empire. Under the fireworks, millions of Soviet soldiers celebrated. They had marched from the ruins of Stalingrad to the heart of the Reich. They buried comrades in every city they conquered. They believed they had fought for freedom, but freedom never came. When they returned home, many of them were arrested, accused of being tainted by the West. Thousands of Soviet prisoners of war, men who had survived Nazi camps, were sent straight to the gulags. Their crime? Being captured alive. To Stalin, survival without his permission was treason. And so, victory turned into another purge. Across Eastern Europe, red flags rose over shattered cities. Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, Berlin. Each one promised liberation. Each one delivered submission. The NKVD moved in before the diplomats. Arrests before treaties. Fear before freedom. And as the smoke cleared from the war, the truth became impossible to ignore. The man the world had called Uncle Joe was not a savior. He was the architect of a new prison. The Allies celebrated victory. Churchill raised his glass. Roosevelt smiled for the cameras. They had defeated Hitler. But in doing so, they had empowered another tyrant. The world wanted a hero. It chose Stalin, not because he was righteous, but because he was necessary. And in that choice, the line between good and evil blurred forever. When the war ended, Stalin stood taller than ever. Half of Europe bowed to him. His enemies were dead. His people were too afraid to speak. He had starved millions. He had purged the faithful. He had executed his own generals. And yet, He died in his bed. No bullet, no trial, no reckoning. The world called him a hero. His people called him father of nations. But history remembers something else. A man who built his power from fear, fed it with blood, and left behind a shadow that still stains the century. Because in the end, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin did what no other dictator ever managed. He won everything, lost nothing, and escaped the judgment of men. This is the legacy of Stalin, the man who turned a nation into a weapon and a war into his redemption, a dictator who never fell.